So this tutorial is going to be about a little bit about watercolour and layers and how I use layers in watercolour. Often I like to do underpainting, which is when you put down an initial layer or two under the sort of main details that go in. So the original reference drawing for this, I think I can't use for to show you, but there's lots of images of Callanish standing stones on the internet, and they'll give you a sort of vibe of the place at a sort of sunrise or sunset. So for this particular drawing, the line work is obviously all done first with some detail put in on the stones, and then some thicker outlines around the stones that are closest to the camera, closest to the viewer. So for the sky, there is lots of different colours in this sky. There is sort of pinks and yellows and blues, and some quite dark blues, which I've put in, and you'll see as we go along how I've put those colours in. So at the moment, obviously, I'm just mixing up some colours, and I've started with some really pale yellow on the horizon. Now I don't necessarily want to go in with a blue straight away there, because on top of that it's going to make a green. So I'm using a grey, which is a mixture of ultramarine and I think Van Dyke brown for that one. But there's obviously quite a lot of blue still in it. And you may see areas where there's a sort of green tinge in it, but I'm not being too fussy about that. So, as you can see here, I'm obviously painting over the top of the stones. Now, I could have used masking fluid on the stones, but at this stage I'm not that bothered, because the stones are going to have a little bit of dark in them anyway. They're not going to be absolutely immaculate and white. And because the paint's very, very wet in wet here, I can still go in with a tissue and lift out a little bit of that colour just locally on those stones if needs be. So the primary wet in wet technique at the beginning of this is very much just putting in those separate colours, you know, those reds, that sort of blues, that little hint of yellow, a little bit of, I think it's a quinacridone rose or a potter's pink I've used there. And again, I'm just trying to, while it's still wet, trying to dab in a little bit of extra pigment to try and create some areas of slight granulation. You can see the granulation is where it looks like a little cloud burst is coming out. So finally, there's a little bit of hot in the clouds, a little bit of heat in these clouds. So I'm sort of adding that in, but then that's quinacridone gold that's gone in there. But then I'm softening it off again, and I think that helps tie in with the line on the horizon a little bit. A little bit of that late evening or early morning sort of warmth in the sky. So I'm going to go in here with a tissue and just lift out a little bit of that pigment that's on the standing stones, just because it makes it a little bit easier to control independently the tone and values of those things. I don't necessarily have to do this, and I don't really have to do it very accurately. I like to generally sort of work on the sky and then the ground. I find the sky is actually weirdly the funniest way to start, because I like big daft skies, and I'm going to do a lot more tutorials on skies and watercolour. And I also find that some images really don't need any more than this. See, this stage here, you could leave it, I think, and have it as a sort of selective colouring process, rather than going and adding extra detail and extra colouring. Rather than going in and adding extra detail and colour. So there I was just being a bit of a fusspot and tidying up some of the edges. Now this is the stage where, unless you want it all to bleed together in a bit of a mush, the best thing you can do is add in, use the hairdryer to dry off that layer of watercolour that's in the sky, so that when you add in the foreground, it doesn't all mush together. I'm adding in a little bit more sky detail here, which is probably just really unnecessary. I think I'm having a fiddle basically here. As you can see, the granulation in the skies worked quite well to create some sort of cloud effects. It is dry, you can see it's a much softer image, and you'll see the image click across, there we go, and you can see it's much softer now. So when you're actually applying watercolour, it's really good to remember that you can actually be quite heavy-handed, particularly when it's wet in wet, because things tend to sort of go a lot more diffuse before they dry. Okay, so the foreground painting is going to be split up into different layers. There's going to be a layer in the front, which I suppose you could call the grass. There's going to be a layer behind that, which is the sort of far distance, middle distance. And then there's going to be a layer beyond that, which is the far distance, which could be hills in the background, or you know, a mountain or something in the background, and that's going to give you a sense of depth in the picture. And it's also going to give you somewhere to sort of walk through the picture for, you know, you can imagine yourself walking through those stones and heading off up a hillside or something. So what I've done here is I've mixed a little bit of Hansa yellow, a little bit of French ultramarine, and other bits and bobs to make a little bit of palette wash, I think, to make what I would call a flat green or a very matte green. So underpainting something like a moorland or a sort of grassy scene, you want something that's quite matte, and then you can add colour on top of that. If you think about the overall lighting conditions when you're sketching or drawing or painting, is if you have no direct sun and it's going to be a pre-dawn or post-sunset, all those bright greens that in the sunlight would pop and really come to life, they're not going to do that. They're going to look blue. Shadow is in its very nature colder than, in terms of colour temperature, colder than a notch shadow. And by that I mean, if you had a colour that in sun looked a bright green, in shadow it would look a darker green. So it's really interesting if you really study an image and you really look. People have said, you know, drawing is all about looking, and I get that. But sometimes it's just about doing, and often what you're trying to represent there, what you're trying to capture, is not what everyone sees. It might be just what you see. You know, I've seen people who will go up on the moors in the Peak District and they will paint with heather and splash paint around, and they're not creating a photographic representation of what's there. They're, you know, very much creating, you know, dancing by the beat of their own drum or sketching from their own palette. But anyway, you still have to look at your environment and you still have to think about those values. So as we get further back into this image, there is more. You can see I made a mess there. I actually drew that stone in. So what I'm doing here is I'm going in with some tissue paper and lifting the paint out. I've actually made a really big error in this image. Fortunately, I've been lucky enough to go several times. So I've made a bit of I've made a massive mistake with this image. In the middle of Calendish Standing Stones, there is a really, really big monolith, which is like a central stone. I'm not sure whether it's a capstone that's been lifted up or whatever, but I missed it out in this picture. But I didn't stop the drawing. When I realised after I'd inked it in, I didn't just throw the drawing away or turn it over and do another one. I kept it because I actually had a technique that I wanted to explore, and I think it just showed that just because even in the initial stages of a drawing you make an absolute pig's ear of it, doesn't mean you should stop. It gives you the perfect opportunity to say, well, do you know what, this drawing is not going to be hung up in you know, the Uffizi gallery, so now is an opportunity to try and do something really different. So if you make a mistake during your drawing, it should actually be a freeing and liberating experience, so that you can go on and maybe throw some splash and paint over it, or use stipples, or paint with your fingers, or whatever. But at that point, all bets are off. That painting is completely safe to do whatever you want with. There's no pressure. Okay. So now I'm starting to put in a little bit of detail, a little bit of dark and light, to try and express some sense of the textures that are in and around the rocks. Here I'm using a slightly more greener green. I think I actually used some sap green here. which is a Daniel Smith colour, but it's a pre-mixed green, but it tends to be, I tend to knock out a little bit of the overt green by adding in a few other bits and bobs. Either mute it with a little bit of an orange type colour or a red, or sometimes just darken it down with a blue, and then add in a bit of natural sienna to sort of warm it and to make it a little bit more sort of organic. So I think that's what I'm doing here. I'm bringing in a bit of the sort of sienna colour, which is like a sort of yellow ochre, I guess, same sort of tone colour, and trying to break up that big piece of flat green in the middle of the stones. So here I'm adding in some extra foreground, slightly darker and a bit splashy, and this is again just to try and tell the story of a little bit more texture, or how to show there's a bit more texture. Now adding in spots and sort of ripples and water like this it's all about creating texture. It's not necessarily even representing something that's there, but that said, I think in this original image I do remember there was some slightly muddier bits. So I'm breaking up those areas of, I'm not sure about that rose that I've put in there, and I think I realised as soon as I put it in that it was probably the wrong colour. So to break up some of those areas, some of those areas of just flat green, I am actually trying to here pick up on some of the colours that we have in the sky, and that's not to create like a reflection that you would get necessarily in a puddle or something, but it's just to try and incorporate a few of those tones, because I think it can give a more balanced feel to a picture. So again, dotting in some quite thick pigment here in a way I'm trying to get it to bloom and push around a bit, so that I get a little bit of free grass, as it were, without drawing blades. You get a sense of a sort of balloon of grass. Now that's dried there, and it's been hair dried, and you can see again that foreground has really softened off quite a lot. But there is still a mixture of hard and soft edges in the grass, which looks, that's how grass looks. It looks quite nice. So that foreground that was put in with quite big juicy pigment has dried, or I've used a hairdryer on it, and as you can see, it's not as, again, when it dries it's a lot more gentle actually. So it's another example of, you can be quite heavy-handed really sometimes with your watercolour. So I think the final stage really for me on these ones is just to put in an extra little bit of the back in with a bit more sort of shadow detail on the stones themselves. So I think that works quite well. So now really it's a case of saying, do we leave it there? Which, I think you could, or do you go in and put some details of those stones in, the layers of rock on those stones? So inevitably I go and put a bit more detail in. So here we go. So initially, what I'm doing here is just creating a little bit of separation between various elements of the stones. Because if you look at the structure of these stones, particularly like in the photos in low light, you'll see there is, because they're made of sort of layers, a little bit like the grain on a piece of wood. There is thin layers of shadow. I'm also going to be trying to use a sort of a slightly drier brush technique here, where now the brush is slightly less wet, I can just drag it down and it creates broken lines on this slightly textured paper. So often I will do that sort of dry brush technique as a base and then go in and add some details on top. So I think what I've decided to do here is really just go in and just do some final bits with the rigger brush, which is a way of actually doing a lot more detailed, which is a way of doing a more detailed shadow, and also probably capturing and reinforcing or also a way of doubling down really on the texture of those rocks. Now, one of the things I really do like using is, particularly at the end of a painting or a drawing, is the white gel pen, and that's just to create some little bits of texture, even little dots sometimes in a single block of colour with a few white dots in can look very different to just the single block of colour. So I'll be using the white gel pen here in a minute and just adding a few extra little finishing touches. I just want to say for the record that this is my technique. It's not unique to me. It's just a very standard sort of line and wash way of working. But it's not the right way. I mean, I know people who would approach this, with paint first. I know people who would use sticks to daub on acrylics. I know zillions of different artists who do things in different ways. I'm not saying this is the right way or it's even ultimately the way for you, but it is an easy way because it's quite process driven to learn. The whole line and wash sort of technique is based pretty much on a drawing of sorts, some line work, pencil, ink, and then it can be a single application of a watercolour, one or two colours, and as complicated as you want it to be. So I mean, some of the most effective line and wash I've seen is being a really loose line drawing with a single colour splashed over the page, literally splashed over, and that's it. There's no right or wrong. The only mistake you'll ever make is putting too much pressure on yourself and not enjoying the process. That is the biggest mistake most artists, anyone who is learning anything, would make. It's very rare that a toddler gets to the frustrated that they can't walk, and then they just say, "Do you know what? I'm not going to walk." When you're a kid, you're fearless. You learn. You pick up language. You pick up skills all the time. Anyway, so yeah, I hope you've enjoyed that. It's a little bit of a deep dive into watercolours and layers, but sometimes I think it's nice to cover things a little bit more thoroughly than I normally would. So yeah. So thank you for stopping by again, and if there's anything you want me to cover, please do get in touch. Like and subscribe, that would be great. Or you could buy me a coffee, or you could head over to my website and buy an original piece of mine, or whatever. But just keep in touch, and if you've stayed to the end, well done. We'll see you soon. Bye bye.